At my daughter's wedding, they took my money, erased my name, and put my photograph at the grand entrance with a caption that read "No entry." They thought I would just turn around and disappear quietly. They didn't know I was about to give them and their entire guest list a history lesson they would never forget. The air in my living room was thick, heavy, like the moments before a summer storm rolls over Atlanta. This room, my fortress built with oak bookshelves I crafted by hand and walls of solid, reassuring brick, had always been my sanctuary. Today, it felt like a courtroom, and I was the one on trial. My daughter, Brianna, my only child, sat perched on the edge of the armchair opposite me. She was beautiful in her cream-colored business dress, but a tension pulled at the corners of her mouth, a tell I had recognized since she was a little girl trying to hide a broken vase. Beside her, her fiancé, Adam Sterling, lounged as if he already owned the place. One leg crossed over the other, his polished Italian leather shoes reflecting the lamplight. He placed a glossy brochure for the Sterling Grand Hall on the walnut coffee table, the same table I made for my Isabella on our 20th anniversary. It felt like a violation. Adam began, his voice smooth as silk but lacking any real warmth. "We're so glad you could make time for us, Joseph. There are just a few final wedding details we need to lock in." I simply nodded, waiting. A lifetime of work has taught me that what people don't say is often far more important than what they do. Brianna cleared her throat, her eyes darting away from mine. That's when I knew the hammer was about to fall. "Dad," she started, her voice unnaturally sweet, the one she used when she was about to ask for something she knew I wouldn't like. "Adam and I have been talking a lot about the ceremony and well about the speeches." I remained silent. The speech. I had already written it 100 times in my head since the day she announced her engagement. It wasn't just a speech. It was the final chapter in the book of my fatherhood. It was the words I owed Isabella, a final report to let her know I had done my job, that our little girl was grown and ready to start a family of her own. I would have talked about the day she was born, how her tiny hand wrapped around my finger, and I felt a strength I never knew I had. I would have shared the story of her first attempt at building a Lego tower, how she cried in frustration until I showed her the importance of a strong foundation, a lesson I hoped she'd carry into her marriage. The Sterling family. Brianna continued, glancing at her fiancé for a boost of courage. They have very old traditions, very formal. At the reception, it's customary for only the father of the groom to give the main toast. She paused, taking a deep breath before delivering the final blow. "So you won't need to give a speech." The words hung in the air between us. "You won't need to." Two simple words, but they landed with the force of a prison door slamming shut. They didn't mean, "You can relax, Dad." They meant, "Your role is finished here." My first instinct wasn't to argue. It was to observe a habit forged on loud and dangerous construction sites. My gaze drifted from Brianna to the fireplace mantel. There, in a silver frame, was Isabella, smiling, her eyes sparkling as if she knew a joyful secret. "What did I promise you, Bella? I promised I'd take care of her. But what does that mean when she is the one pushing me away?" My silence stretched on, making the room feel smaller. Adam, sensing the shift, spoke up. "Of course, we are incredibly grateful for your contribution, Joseph. This is just about keeping things streamlined, elegant. It's about merging our two families in the best way possible." "Merging," I repeated, my voice a low rumble. "And merging means cutting out half of the story, Adam." He blinked, his polite smile faltering for a second. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to people agreeing with him. Brianna rushed to smooth things over. "That's not what he means, Dad. You're still a huge part of it. You're walking me down the aisle. That's more important than any speech, right?" She was trying to offer me a consolation prize, a small part to play to make me feel included. But she didn't understand. Walking her down the aisle was my duty. The speech was my voice. They were willing to accept my actions, but they wanted to silence my words. I took a deep breath, the familiar scent of old wood and lemon polish filling my lungs. "All right," I said, and watched a flicker of relief cross Brianna's face. "If that's what you want." But I knew this was only the first battle, and in this war my silence would be my greatest weapon. I would not give them the satisfaction of an argument. I would give them the discomfort of my cold compliance. They wanted me to be an invisible father at my own daughter's wedding. I would do them one better. I would become a ghost they would never be able to forget. Adam leaned back, victorious. He picked up another folder from his briefcase. Now he would move from attacking my fatherhood to attacking my life's work. On to a more pleasant topic, he said, flipping through pages. The cost. He said the word with an unconcealed relish. The Sterling Grand Hall is a premier venue, and it comes with a premier price tag. He slid a piece of paper across the table. I didn't have to look at it. I already knew the number would be obscene. It was part of the game. I know you're a busy man, he continued, and here came the second blade with your hobby. Hobby. The word spoken so casually struck me like a physical blow. He was talking about the Isabella Hayes Foundation, an organization I had poured my entire soul into for the last decade. An organization that had given over 50 full scholarships to brilliant, underprivileged young men and women of color pursuing degrees in engineering and architecture. An organization named for the woman who was my entire world. And he called it a hobby. I felt the blood rush to my head, a hot, potent anger I hadn't felt in years. I thought of Keisha, a young woman from the toughest part of Atlanta, who used our scholarship to become the lead engineer on a major bridge project in California. I thought of David, who finished his master's in architecture and was now designing affordable housing for homeless communities. They were not a hobby. They were living, breathing legacies. Brianna saw the change in my expression. Adam, she said softly, a warning. But he was on a roll. All I mean is, he said, ignoring her, it's a very admirable thing you do, Joseph. Very charitable. But given the scale of this wedding, this milestone in Brianna's life, I was just wondering if there was room for some flexibility. Flexibility. I repeated, my voice now as cold and hard as steel. Yes, he said, delivering the cruelest proposition. What if you were to pause the foundation's activities for 1 year? Just one. The funds, instead of going to those purposes, could be redirected to give Brianna the wedding she deserves. A start in life befitting the Sterling name. I looked at my daughter. I searched her face for a sign of protest, a shake of the head, anything to defend the legacy of her own mother. I found nothing. She just stared at me with wide, pleading eyes, eyes that begged, "Please, Dad, just this once, for me." Her silence was her consent. In that moment, I realized my daughter wasn't just in awe of the Sterling's world. She was being assimilated by it. She was willing to trade her mother's legacy for a party. I remembered the night Isabella passed. The sterile white hospital room, the smell of antiseptic. She gripped my hand. Her own was frail, but her grip was firm. "Joseph," she whispered, her breath shallow. "Promise me. Don't ever let a lack of money stand in the way of a brilliant mind. You build them a bridge, just like you've built so many others. The foundation wasn't a charity. It was a promise. The last one I ever made to the love of my life." I placed my hands flat on the table, lacing my fingers together to keep them from shaking. I looked directly at Adam, ignoring Brianna for a moment. "Adam," I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "Let me be very clear. The Isabella Foundation is not a hobby. It is a promise. It is the legacy of my wife and Brianna's mother. And it is not for sale." I punctuated each of the last words. Not for sale. The air went out of the room. It took Adam a moment to recover. His smug smile was gone, replaced by a mask of rigid indignation. He was a man who used money and status as levers to move the world. He had just encountered something immovable. Brianna finally broke, silent tears tracing paths down her cheeks. "Dad." I held up a hand. "Enough. This discussion is over." I had shown them my line in the sand. Now I would see how they chose to cross it. The silence that followed my declaration was different. It was the silence of a battle concluded, a line drawn. Brianna, desperate to salvage the situation, grabbed the glossy brochure. "It's okay," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I understand, Dad. If the budget is the issue, I can find another venue. Something more affordable." She said it as if she were making a great sacrifice, a gesture to show she was still on my side. But I knew she was just trying to put out the fire. Adam wouldn't allow it. He had lost face, and now he had to reassert his dominance. He placed his hand over hers, a gesture that looked comforting, but was an act of control. "No, darling," he said, his smooth voice now carrying an edge of ice. "You don't understand. A Sterling wedding happens at the Sterling Grand Hall. It is our tradition. Our family's legacy." He used my own word against me, twisting it like a knife. "I'm sure Joseph, being a man of principle, will understand. I'm sure he will find a way. And just like that, the burden was tossed back to me heavier than before. He wasn't just asking for money. He was daring me, implying that if I failed, I was the one disrespecting tradition. I was the one shattering the harmony. He had turned blackmail into a test of character. I looked at my daughter, now quiet under Adam's touch. I had lost the battle for her allegiance. I sighed, a sound of profound weariness, not of defeat. I had seen enough. The path forward was clear. "All right," I said, looking Adam straight in the eye. "I'll cover the costs. Send me the bill." Brianna looked at me, her tear-filled eyes a mixture of hope and guilt. Adam smiled a slow, triumphant grin. He thought he had won. He thought he had backed me into a corner and forced me to play by his rules. He didn't realize that with those words I wasn't agreeing to play his game. I was starting my own. The front door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the sudden profound silence. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just sat there in the house I had built with my own 2 hands and felt the weight of the emptiness my daughter had left behind. The scent of her expensive perfume lingered in the air, a ghost of her presence. It was a foreign scent, one that didn't belong among the familiar smells of sawdust, old books, and Isabella's faint, lingering rose potpourri. It was the smell of a world I didn't belong to, a world that was now claiming my daughter. I looked at the glossy brochure for the Sterling Grand Hall still sitting on the coffee table I had built for my wife. It looked like a piece of trash, an advertisement for a life that valued varnish over solid wood. The anger from before had cooled, settling into something harder, denser. It settled into resolve. My hand didn't shake as I reached for the phone. My fingers, thick and calloused from a lifetime of labor, felt steady. I didn't call my banker to worry about the obscene amount of money they were demanding. I didn't call a friend to complain about the disrespect. I called the one person I knew would understand that this was never about money. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice crisp and professional, but with an underlying warmth that was all her own. "Robert's law firm. Alicia, it's Joseph Hayes." "Joseph." Her voice immediately softened. "Is everything all right? You don't usually call after business hours." I could picture her in her office, probably surrounded by stacks of legal books, a small, determined woman who wielded the law like a master craftsman wielded a hammer. "I'm fine, Alicia, but I need your help." I took a breath and recounted the entire conversation, keeping my voice even, reporting the facts as if I were describing a problem on a blueprint. I told her about the speech, about Brianna's pleading eyes, about Adam's casual dismissal of my life's work as a hobby. When I repeated his words, paused the foundation's activities for 1 year, a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line was her only interruption. When I finished, there was a moment of charged silence. Then Alicia spoke, and her voice had lost all its professional detachment. It was the voice of a daughter defending her father. He called the Isabella Foundation a hobby. He actually said that. The nerve of that man. "Joseph, you want me to call them? I can have a conversation with this Adam Sterling that he won't soon forget." I smiled, a faint, tired smile. "That's why I called you, Alicia. I knew you'd get it. But no. No calls to them. I don't want to fight them on their terms. I want to fight them on mine." Her loyalty wasn't just professional. It was personal. It was forged in the past, in the shared history of our families. I remembered her father, Franklin Roberts, a lanky, soft-spoken man who was the first foreman I ever hired. He was a man with a brilliant mind for logistics and an unshakable integrity. In the early days, when my company was just me, him, and a handful of hopeful young men, we worked side by side, sweating under the Georgia sun, turning dirt and dreams into buildings. Franklin used to talk about his daughter constantly. "My Alicia," he'd say, wiping sweat from his brow during a lunch break, "she's got a mind like a steel trap. Gonna be a lawyer someday. Gonna argue circles around all those fancy rich boys." When Alicia got accepted into law school, Franklin was prouder than I had ever seen him. But I saw the worry in his eyes too, the quiet fear of a working man staring down the mountain of tuition fees. The next day, I gave him a bonus, a check large enough to cover her textbooks for the entire first year. I told him it was for his excellent work on the community center project. He knew what it was really for. He tried to refuse, but I stopped him. "This isn't a gift, Franklin," I told him. "It's an investment in the future." Alicia never forgot that. She had worked her way through law school, graduating at the top of her class, and when she opened her own firm, I was her first client. She understood that the money I had was built not on stocks and inheritance, but on calloused hands, on promises kept, and on the loyalty of good men like her father. She knew the Isabella Foundation wasn't a tax write-off. It was the continuation of a promise made to a dying woman. "No, Alicia," I said again, my voice firm, pulling myself back to the present. "I've already agreed to pay for the venue." There was a pause. "You what, Joseph? You can't let them bully you like this. We can contest those charges. They're exorbitant." "It's not about the money," I interrupted. "Not anymore." "They think it is. They think that's the only language I understand. Let them believe it. I need you to do something else for me. Something that might sound strange. I'm listening. I want you to investigate the Sterling Grand Hall. And I don't mean their booking rates or their catering contracts. I want to know about the building itself. I want the deed. I want to know who owns the land it's sitting on. I want to know who owned it 50, 60, 70 years ago. I want its history, Alicia. I want its bones." The line was quiet for a few seconds. I could hear the faint hum of her computer in the background. She was processing my request, a request far outside the normal duties of a corporate lawyer. "The history of the venue?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. "Joseph, what are you looking for? What do you think you'll find?" I looked at the blueprints for a library I was funding through the foundation rolled up neatly on my desk. Every structure has a foundation. "Alicia," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's the most important part. You can't see it, but it holds everything up. Some foundations are built on solid rock. Others are built on sand, or worse, on secrets. And I have a feeling the Sterling family's foundation isn't nearly as solid as they want the world to believe." Another moment of silence. But this time I knew she understood. She wasn't just my lawyer anymore. She was my partner, my investigator. "Okay, Joseph," she said, her voice now filled with a new energy, a new purpose. "Okay, I'm on it. I'll start digging first thing in the morning. I'll find out what that ground is made of. Thank you, Alicia. Talk to you soon, Joseph." I hung up the phone. The heavy feeling in my chest hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. The hurt was still there, a dull ache for the daughter I felt I was losing. But now it was mixed with something else. It was being forged into a tool, a purpose. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. I had spent my life building things that were meant to last. Bridges, schools, community centers, things with strong foundations. Adam Sterling and his family, they were builders too, but they built walls, they built hierarchies, and they were about to find out what happens when a man who builds bridges decides it's time to tear a wall down. The game was on, and I was finally ready to play. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was cold and clinical, invoice and payment details, Sterling Hayes wedding. It sat in my inbox for a full hour, a digital serpent waiting patiently. I didn't open it immediately. I took my time. I finished my coffee. I watered the ficus tree Isabella had loved so much, its leaves a vibrant, stubborn green. I was not going to let them rush me. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of my anxiety. When I finally clicked it open, the document that loaded was not so much an invoice as it was a declaration of war written in the language of money. It was a masterpiece of condescension. A multi-page PDF, exquisitely designed with the Sterling family crest watermarked on the background. And the itemization, the itemization, was a work of art. They had listed everything, every single detail with a price tag, designed not for accounting, but for humiliation. It began with the venue fee, a round and arrogant number, but it was the details that followed that were meant to deliver the killing blow. $20,000 for atmospheric uplighting, $15,000 for custom-carved artisanal ice sculptures with a note specifying the design was to be the Sterling family crest, $5,000 for hand-pressed European linen napkins, $30,000 for exclusive use of the grand foyer for guest arrival. There were charges for things I couldn't even comprehend, a floral deconstruction fee, a vintage silverware polishing surcharge, a dedicated coat check concierge team. It was a symphony of absurdity, a list of expenses created by people so insulated by their wealth that they had forgotten the value of a dollar. They had only ever known its power, and at the very bottom of the final page, in a bold, unforgiving font, was the grand total. $250,000. $250,000. For one evening. I stared at the number on the screen. I felt a laugh bubbling up from my chest, a dry, humorless sound. I actually laughed. Not from shock or despair. I laughed at the sheer, unadulterated pettiness of it all. They really thought this number would break me. They thought this number, this monument to their own vanity, was the biggest, most intimidating number I had ever stared down. They had no idea. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The email with its $250,000 price tag could wait. I walked down the hall to my study, the real heart of my house. The walls were lined not with expensive art, but with framed blueprints and photographs of completed projects. I ran my hand along the spines of the thick binders that filled one entire bookshelf. Each one represented a piece of my life, a piece of my soul. I pulled one out, its label faded from the sun. Southside Community Center, 1998. I opened the binder on my large work table. The original blueprints, drawn by my own hand, were tucked inside a plastic sleeve. I could still remember the smell of the graphite and the clean, crisp paper. I remembered the arguments with the city council, the long nights negotiating with suppliers, the feeling of the sun on my back as we poured the foundation. I flipped to the back of the binder and found the final budget summary. I traced my finger down the column of figures past the cost of concrete, steel, lumber, and labor. The total cost to build a 2-story facility that gave hundreds of children a safe place to go after school, a library to do their homework, and a gym to play basketball, in a place that had become the beating heart of an entire neighborhood, was $220,000. $30,000 less than a single party. I remembered a boy named Marcus, all of 12 years old, who had helped us paint the walls one weekend. He had looked at me with his serious old man eyes and said, "Mr. Hayes, this place, it saved my life. It really did." I wondered where Marcus was today. I hoped he was doing well. I closed the binder and a wave of calm washed over me. This was value. This was real. I pulled out another binder. The Isabella Hayes Memorial Bridge, 2007. This project was my heart. It was a simple pedestrian bridge, an elegant arc of steel and concrete connecting a low-income neighborhood with the city's main hospital campus. Before the bridge, the residents, most of them elderly, had to take 3 different buses to get to a doctor's appointment. It was an all-day ordeal. After the bridge, it was a 10-minute walk. Inside the binder were photographs from the dedication ceremony. I saw the proud, smiling faces of the community members. I saw the mayor shaking my hand. I felt even now the phantom warmth of Isabella's presence beside me that day as I cut the ribbon. The total cost to build a permanent piece of civic infrastructure that saved people time, saved people money, and very likely saved people's lives was $300,000. Just $50,000 more than my daughter's wedding. Finally, I reached for a slimmer file, one from the foundation. It held letters from students. I pulled out the very first one we had ever received from a young woman named Sarah Jenkins. The paper was worn soft from being read many times. Her letter was filled with a raw, powerful gratitude that brought a familiar ache to my throat. She wrote about being the first person in her family to ever attend college, about the dreams she had of being an architect. I read one line aloud to the quiet room. "Mr. Hayes, you and the foundation didn't just give me money for tuition. You gave me a foundation of my own, a chance to build a life I never thought was possible." The total cost of that 4-year scholarship, the investment that changed the entire trajectory of her family for generations to come, $40,000. Less than what Adam and Brianna were planning to spend on flowers and atmospheric uplighting. I stood there for a long time, surrounded by the evidence of my life's work. These binders, these memories, this was my wealth. It was a wealth measured not in dollars, but in lives touched, in futures built, in promises kept. I walked back to my office and sat down in front of the computer. I looked at the invoice again. The number $250,000 now seemed laughably small. It was an empty number, devoid of meaning, devoid of value. It represented nothing but ego. My contempt for it, and for the people who wielded it as a weapon, was absolute. Their vision was so limited. They used their vast resources to construct elaborate temporary monuments to themselves. I used mine to build things that would outlast me. I took a deep breath. There was no hesitation. There was no more anger. There was only clarity. I would pay the bill. I would transfer every last ridiculous penny. It was not a surrender. It was a strategic investment. I wasn't buying them a wedding. I was buying myself a ticket to the final act. I was purchasing the stage upon which I would deliver a history lesson they and their entire world would never see coming. The call came a week later, a week of suffocating silence, of going through the motions of my life while a silent secret war was being waged in the dusty archives of the city records office. I had transferred the $250,000. The money left my account with a quiet digital beep, an anticlimactic end to a sum that could have built futures. I received a sterile automated receipt from the Sterling Corporation. No thank you, no personal acknowledgement. Just a confirmation that the transaction was complete. They had my money. They thought they had my surrender. Every day I waited for the phone to ring. Every day I expected Alicia to call and tell me it was a dead end, that my gut feeling was just the paranoia of an old man. When the phone finally buzzed with her name on the screen, I felt my heart hammer against my ribs. "Joseph," she said, her voice low and tight with an energy I could feel through the phone. "Are you sitting down?" "I am now," I replied, lowering myself into the worn leather chair in my study. "What did you find, Alicia?" "You were right. You were more right than you could have possibly imagined." She took a deep breath, and I could hear the rustle of papers. "I started with the deed just like you asked. The paper trail is clean on the surface. The Sterling Family Trust has officially owned that parcel of land since 1972. They purchased it from a registered holding company, a corporation called Metropolitan Development Group. Everything looks perfectly legal. The holding company was dissolved a few months after the sale, which is a little unusual but not unheard of. So it's a dead end," I said, a wave of disappointment washing over me. "No," she replied, and now I could hear the excitement in her voice, the thrill of the hunt. That's what they wanted people to think. The holding company was a ghost, a legal fiction created for a single purpose. The real owner, the one who was forced to sell to them, was a community cooperative. And the building that stood on that land before the Sterling Grand Hall was ever even a thought in their minds, Joseph. The building was called the Renaissance Ballroom. The name hit me like a physical force. The Renaissance Ballroom. It wasn't just a name. It was a memory, a lifetime, a whole world. Suddenly, I wasn't a 70-year-old man in his quiet study. I was 19 again. I was wearing my best suit, the one I had saved for months to buy. I could smell the scent of Isabella's gardenia perfume, feel the nervous sweat on my palms as I held her hand. I remembered walking into the Renaissance. It wasn't grand in the way the Sterlings would understand. It was grand in a way that mattered. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and hope. A live jazz band was playing on the stage, the saxophone wailing a song of pure joy. The vast wooden dance floor was filled with people from our community dressed in their Sunday best, laughing, dancing, living. It was our place. It wasn't just a building made of brick and mortar. It was a building made of our pride. It was where our parents held their charity events, where my friends and I had our high school proms, where we gathered to organize and to celebrate. It was the living, breathing heart of our world. And I had taken Isabella there on our first real date. I remembered spinning her around on that dance floor, her head thrown back in a laugh that I can still hear as clearly as if it were yesterday. Joseph, Alicia's voice pulled me back from the past. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I remember it. I remember it all." Alicia's voice softened with understanding. "I thought you might. It was a cornerstone of the black community for almost 30 years. But the story of how they lost it, that's the part that will make you sick. It wasn't a simple sale, Joseph. It was an execution carried out with zoning laws and tax codes instead of bullets." She began to lay out the facts, and each one was a blow. It started in 1970, a sudden, inexplicable property tax reassessment that tripled the annual bill for the ballroom. The cooperative, which ran on donations and ticket sales, was barely breaking even. They couldn't afford it. Then came the city inspectors, a barrage of frivolous citations. One week it was a fire code violation for having too many chairs. The next it was a health code violation because the popcorn machine was supposedly 2 inches too close to a wall. Each citation came with a hefty fine, draining their legal funds, bleeding them dry, one paper cut at a time. It was a coordinated attack. She continued, her voice hardening with a lawyer's righteous anger. While the city was squeezing them, the banks that held their loans suddenly grew nervous. They started calling in their debts. It was a slow, legal strangulation. They were being choked, and no one was coming to help. And then at the 11th hour, when foreclosure was imminent, the Metropolitan Development Group appeared. This mysterious company, with no history and no other assets, made a cash offer. It was criminally low, less than half the land's actual value, but it was their only way out. The cooperative, broken and exhausted, had no choice. They took the deal to avoid complete ruin. They sold their heart to save their skin. My fists were clenched so tight my knuckles were white. And the holding company, I said, my voice a low growl. Who was behind it? Who pulled the strings? This is where it gets dark, Joseph. Alicia paused. I had to go to the physical city archives. I spent 2 days going through boxes of old, undigitized corporate filings from the 70s. It was buried deep under 3 layers of shell corporations and lawyers' names. But I found him. The sole director and shareholder of the Metropolitan Development Group. The man who orchestrated the entire predatory scheme, who then turned around and sold the land to his own family's trust for the symbolic price of $1. The man's name was Arthur Sterling, Adam Sterling's grandfather. The final piece clicked into place. The air left my lungs. The dots didn't just connect. They formed a monstrous, predatory picture that stretched back 50 years. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a story of a business transaction. This was the story of a theft, a grand generational theft of our history, our culture, our heart. My daughter's wedding. It wasn't just a party at a fancy, overpriced hall. It was a victory lap on stolen ground. The Sterling family wasn't just hosting a celebration of love. They were unknowingly or perhaps knowingly celebrating their family's legacy of conquest right in the faces of the children and grandchildren of the very people they had displaced. Every laugh, every champagne toast, every dance on their marble floors would be an insult to the memories of the people who had danced on the wooden floors of the Renaissance. The picture of me at the entrance, the sign that would say "No Entry." It all took on a horrifying new meaning. It wasn't just a personal slight from a disrespectful son-in-law. It was a historical echo. It was the ghost of Arthur Sterling telling me and people like me that we were still not welcome, that we could pay for the party but we could never truly belong. The conflict was no longer about a wedding speech or an insulting invoice. It had been elevated into something far greater. This was a battle for memory, a battle for justice. "Thank you, Alicia," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You've given me everything I need." "What are you going to do, Joseph?" I looked at the picture of Isabella on my mantle. Her smile seemed to encourage me, to give me strength. "They didn't just buy a piece of land, Alicia," I said. "They stole a memory. They tried to bury a piece of our soul under their marble and crystal. And they are about to find out that some memories don't stay buried. Some memories have a price tag that $250,000 doesn't even begin to cover." The day of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of a faded, bruised gray and overcast. I had transferred the money days ago. The transaction was complete. I had fulfilled my part of their cruel bargain. As I drove toward the Sterling Grand Hall, I felt a strange and unsettling calm. I was not a father on his way to his daughter's wedding. I was a general surveying a battlefield before the final charge. I wore my finest suit, a charcoal gray wool that Isabella had picked out for me years ago. It still fit perfectly. My shoes were polished to a mirror shine. My back was straight. I was not coming to this event as a victim. I was coming as a witness. The venue was even more imposing in person than in the glossy brochures. It was a monument of white marble and towering columns, a temple built to the gods of money and status. It was grand, yes, but it was a cold, sterile grandeur. It had none of the warmth, none of the life, none of the soul I remembered from the Renaissance ballroom. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open the doors of expensive European cars. Streams of guests flowed toward the entrance, a river of silk diamonds and smug entitlement. Their laughter sounded thin and brittle in the evening air. I walked among them, a solitary island of dark gray in a sea of pale pastels. I felt their curious glances, the brief dismissive assessments of the old black man walking alone. They did not know who I was, and that was exactly the point. To them, I was invisible. As I approached the grand arched entrance, I saw it. It was placed in the most prominent position, right at the threshold where every single guest would have to pass. A large, ornate easel carved from dark, gleaming mahogany. My steps slowed. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in my stomach. On the easel, nestled in a heavy gilded frame, was not a portrait of Brianna and Adam. It was a photograph of me. It was an old picture, one Brianna had always loved. It was taken about 15 years ago at a charity gala. I was in my late 50s at the peak of my career, smiling, my eyes clear and full of a life they had not yet tried to diminish. They had chosen an image of my strength to be the centerpiece of my humiliation. And then my eyes dropped to the small plaque mounted just below the frame. It was made of polished brass, the letters elegantly engraved, gleaming under the light of the enormous crystal chandelier in the foyer. The inscription was short, 6 words. 6 words that were meant to erase my entire identity. In honor of our benefactor, no entry beyond this point. I read the words once, then twice. I felt the air leave my lungs in a silent rush. Every insult, every slight, every moment of disrespect from the past few months coalesced into this one perfect public act of degradation. Let me break it down for you. In honor of our benefactor, not father of the bride, not even my name Joseph Hayes, just benefactor, a title as cold and impersonal as a bank transaction. They had reduced my entire existence, my love for my daughter, my lifetime of work into a single role, a source of funds. A walking, talking ATM machine honored for its function but denied its humanity. They didn't even have the decency to name the man who had paid for their entire spectacle. I was an anonymous donor to the grand charity of their wedding. And the second part, the part that was the true poison. No entry beyond this point. They had taken my $250,000, used it to construct this stage for their perfect lives, and then they had the audacity to bar me from it. This sign was a wall. A beautifully polished, elegantly engraved wall, but a wall nonetheless. It was the physical manifestation of everything they had been telling me from the beginning. Your money is welcome here, but you are not. Your place is on the outside looking in. You can pay for our world, but you can never be a part of it. And in that moment, the weight of Alicia's discovery, the history of this very ground, came crashing down on me. This wasn't just my arrogant son-in-law and my lost, foolish daughter telling me I couldn't enter. This was the ghost of Arthur Sterling, the man who had strangled the life out of the Renaissance ballroom. This was his voice echoing across 50 years of injustice, telling my people, my community, the same thing all over again. No entry. You are not welcome in the world we have built on the ashes of your own. The personal and the historical, the past and the present, it all merged into one single unbearable moment of clarity. This was not an insult. This was a desecration. I lifted my head, my eyes scanning the opulent foyer beyond the velvet rope, and I saw them. Standing near the bottom of a sweeping marble staircase, arranged like a royal family, were Adam, his parents, and my daughter Brianna. They were all looking directly at me. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see my reaction. Adam and his father wore identical smirks of smug satisfaction. This was their masterstroke. This was how they dealt with inconvenient people. They didn't get their hands dirty with ugly confrontations. They simply bought you, framed you, and hung you on the wall. And Brianna, my daughter, was smiling, a bright, brittle public relations smile. She was looking at me, her eyes shining as if she expected me to be pleased. In her mind, twisted by their influence, this was a brilliant compromise. This was their way of honoring me without having me actually, be there to disrupt the carefully curated guest list. She was so utterly blind to the breathtaking cruelty of it, so lost in their world of surfaces and symbols that she could no longer see the truth of her own actions. She saw a tribute. I saw a tombstone. In that moment, something inside me broke. But it was not my spirit. It was the last fragile thread of hope I had held for the daughter I once knew. I met her gaze across the crowded, cavernous room. I held it. I let her see everything in my eyes. The 40 years of love, the sleepless nights when she was sick, the pride at her graduation, the memory of her mother's smile. And then I let her see the profound, bottomless disappointment, the quiet, aching grief of a father realizing he has lost his child, not to death, but to vanity. Then I did something very simple. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of forgiveness. It was not a nod of understanding. It was a nod of finality, of acknowledgement, a quiet goodbye. And then I turned my back on her. The action was slow, deliberate. I felt the smooth leather of my shoes pivot on the cold marble floor. I squared my shoulders and straightened my spine. I did not rush. I did not stumble. I walked away with the unshakable dignity of a man who knows his own worth. The chattering guests in the entryway parted for me, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. They saw a distinguished elderly black man dressed in his finest clothes leaving the most exclusive party of the year before it had even begun. They didn't understand. But they would. Oh, they would all understand soon enough. I walked through the grand doors out into the cool evening air. I did not look back. The sounds of their world, the tinkling music, and the artificial laughter faded behind me. They thought they had delivered the final word. They thought the story ended here with me on the outside and them on the inside. How wrong they were. The story was just beginning. And I was on my way to write the final chapter. I did not drive home. My house, my sanctuary, would not feel like my own tonight. It would feel like a place of mourning, and I was not ready for that yet. Instead, I drove west away from the glittering, hollow heart of the city. The streetlights blurred into long streaks of gold and white, a river of light carrying me toward the only place I knew I would find peace. The car moved on instinct, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind a strange and quiet landscape. The burning rage I had felt earlier had cooled, leaving behind a profound, crystalline clarity. I saw everything for what it was. The wedding, the money, the insults, they were all just symptoms of a deeper disease. A disease of the soul that values image over substance, power over people. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of Greenwood Cemetery. The sun had just set, and the sky was painted in soft shades of purple and orange. Here there was no valet, no loud music, no judgment. There was only the quiet dignity of the ancient oak trees and the respectful silence of the dead. I parked the car and walked along the familiar path, my footsteps the only sound in the twilight air. I found her headstone easily nestled under a magnificent magnolia tree. It was a simple slab of gray granite, elegant and understated just like she was. The inscription was short. Isabella Hayes, beloved wife and mother, a foundation of love. I sat down on the small stone bench facing her grave. For a few moments I just breathed. I let the peace of this place seep into my bones, a soothing balm on a fresh wound. Before I allowed myself to think, to feel, I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. The screen was bright, a portal to the chaos I had just left behind. I stared at it for a second, then pressed and held the power button. A menu appeared. I tapped power off. The screen flickered and went black. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. I had severed the connection. I had cut their line to me. They could scream into the void all they wanted. I would not hear them until I was ready. I was in control now. I slipped the lifeless phone back into my pocket and turned my attention to Isabella. "Well, Bella," I said, my voice a quiet murmur in the stillness. "You won't believe what our little girl went and did today." I told her everything. I spoke to her as if she were sitting right there beside me, her hand resting warmly on my arm. I told her about the speech and the way Brianna couldn't meet my eyes. I told her about Adam calling your foundation a hobby. I told her about the invoice, every last ridiculous, insulting dollar of it. And then I told her about the picture, the sign, the final cruel twist of the knife. As I spoke, the deep sadness I had been holding back finally washed over me. Was it my fault, Bella? Did I do this to her? I spent my life trying to give her everything I never had. A beautiful home, the best schools, a life without the struggle, without the dirt under her fingernails. I wanted to build a fortress around her to protect her from the harshness of the world. But maybe I built the walls too high. Maybe I protected her so much that she never learned to tell the difference between a foundation of rock and a foundation of sand. She sees the sterling name, the old money, the power, and she thinks it's rock. She can't see that it's built on something rotten. I told her about the Renaissance ballroom, our ballroom. I told her about the stolen land and the stolen history. They're dancing on stolen ground, Bella, our ground. They are celebrating on the very spot where we had our first dance. Can you believe the arrogance, the sheer blind arrogance of it all? I did what I had to do. I couldn't let that stand. I couldn't let them erase us, erase our memories, and use my money to do it. I hope you think it was the right thing. I hope you would have been proud. I sat there as the last of the light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. I felt her presence in the gentle breeze that rustled the magnolia leaves. I felt her approval in the deep, quiet peace that settled over me. I had mourned the daughter I had lost today, and I had made my peace with the actions I had taken. I was ready. After what felt like hours, I knew it was time. I stood up, my joints stiff from the cool night air. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the phone. I pressed the power button. The screen came to life, the manufacturer's logo glowing in the darkness. It took a moment to boot up, a moment of absolute silence. Then it connected to the network. And all hell broke loose. The phone didn't just vibrate, it convulsed in my hand, a frantic, furious buzzing as if it had been possessed. It was a physical manifestation of 3 hours of unchecked panic from their world trying to break into mine. The screen lit up with a blinding cascade of notifications. 1 text message, then 5, then 20. Voicemail alerts, email alerts, a storm of digital desperation. And at the top of the screen, a number that seemed to scream, a number that told a story all on its own, a number that was the sound of a perfectly curated world shattering into a million pieces. 64 missed calls. I stared at the number, my face illuminated by the pale, frantic light of the screen. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a quiet, cold sense of inevitability. The bomb I had planted had finally detonated, and this was the sound of the shockwave reaching me. The show was about to begin. I took a deep, steadying breath, the cool night air of the cemetery calming the frantic buzzing of the phone in my hand. The screen glowed with the number 64. 64 frantic attempts to pull me back into a world I had just decisively left. I scrolled past the dozens of calls from Brianna, the angry-looking block of calls from Adam, the unfamiliar numbers that I knew belonged to his parents. I found the one name I was looking for. I pressed the button and lifted the phone to my ear. She answered on the first ring. Joseph. Her voice was electric, a current of controlled, triumphant energy. I've been trying to reach you. I take it you've seen the fireworks? I saw a few sparks before I turned off my phone, I replied, my voice calm. Why don't you tell me about the inferno? I could almost hear her smile. Inferno is a good word for it. They are in full meltdown. So, where do we begin? Let's start with layer 1. The money. You see, the contract for the venue was written by supremely arrogant people, the kind of people who never imagined that someone like me would actually read all 37 pages of fine print. I found a beautiful little piece of work in Clause 11b, subsection C. It states that for any event with a budget exceeding $100,000, the primary benefactor must be physically present to sign a final indemnity and liability waiver before the main dinner course is served. It's meant to protect them if a guest gets food poisoning from the expensive lobster. I listened, a slow smile spreading across my face in the darkness. Go on. Well, as you know, the primary benefactor was not present to sign the waiver. According to the clause, if the benefactor is absent, the event is immediately classified as at risk. To continue, the hosts are required to pay a supplemental insurance and security bond to cover the venue's liability. That bond, Joseph, is 50% of the total event cost. I did the math, the number tasting sweet on my tongue. $125,000, $125,000. Alicia confirmed, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Due immediately. On a Saturday night after the banks have closed, I received a frantic call from the venue manager about an hour after you left. He said the Sterling patriarch was turning purple, screaming about his reputation, while the catering staff just stood there holding trays of rapidly cooling artisanal appetizers. They were scrambling, trying to get a wire transfer from their emergency investment funds, but it was causing absolute chaos. Their perfect, elegant evening came to a screeching, expensive halt. That's a beautiful little clause, Alicia, I said. A real work of art. But that alone doesn't explain 64 phone calls. Exactly, she said, her voice rising with excitement, which brings us to layer 2, the reputation. While I was digging into the Sterling family's past, I took a little look into their present. It turns out Sterling Enterprises is the lead bidder for the city's new downtown urban renewal project. It's a billion-dollar deal with a B. And to get it, they need to secure the approval of the city council, which means they need to prove they have broad community support, especially from the minority communities whose neighborhoods they plan to renew. I saw where this was going. The wedding, I said. The wedding, she repeated, was a PR stunt of the highest order. It was never just a wedding, it was a performance. They invited Mayor Thompson, Congresswoman Davies, and half the city council. The unspoken theme of the evening was unity, diversity, a blending of two great families. It was all a carefully staged play to show the city's leaders and the press how progressive and inclusive the Sterling family was. A perfect photo opportunity. And then she said, savoring every word, the guest of honor, the father of the bride, the respected community leader and benefactor, Joseph Hayes, is publicly humiliated and barred from entering his own daughter's wedding. Several of your old colleagues from the Community Development Board were there, Joseph. They saw the whole thing. They walked out in protest, and they were not quiet about it. The story spread through that marble hall faster than a wildfire. By the time the sea bass was supposed to be served, the mayor and the congresswoman were already making excuses and slipping out the back door. The Sterlings didn't just lose a party, Joseph. They lost their entire narrative. Their billion-dollar deal is now politically toxic. They're not seen as uniters anymore. They're seen as predators. I closed my eyes, picturing the panic, the dawning horror on their faces as their perfect world crumbled around them. It was more than I could have hoped for. But there was still one more piece, the most important piece. And the history, Alicia, I asked, my voice now quiet, heavy with the weight of what truly mattered. What about the Renaissance? Alicia's voice softened, losing its triumphant edge and gaining a deep, resonant pride. This is layer 3, Joseph. The one that matters, the final act. This is the one for my father and for yours. At precisely 7:30 tonight, just as the chaos over the insurance bond was reaching its peak, every single person of influence in that room, every politician, every journalist, every CEO received an email. The sender was the Isabella Hayes Foundation. The subject line was simple: "The ground beneath your feet, a history of the Sterling Grand Hall." The email began with a single powerful sentence: "Before you enjoy your dinner this evening, we believe you should know the true story of the land upon which you are sitting." And then, Joseph, we told them. We laid out the entire documented history of the Renaissance ballroom. We included historical photos of the vibrant community, the newspaper clippings about the predatory tax hikes, the city record showing the Shell Company, and the final damning document linking it all directly to Arthur Sterling. It was sourced, it was verified, it was irrefutable. We didn't make accusations, we just presented the facts. But we didn't stop there, she said, her voice firm. The email concluded by officially announcing that the Isabella Hayes Foundation had 1 hour prior filed a formal petition with the City Historical Preservation Committee. We are not seeking financial damages from the Sterling family. We are petitioning for the official landmarking of the site, and we are demanding the mandatory installation of a permanent public bronze plaque at the main entrance, detailing the complete and true history of the Renaissance ballroom, its cultural significance, and the methods by which it was taken from the community. That email with all its attachments landed in their inboxes while they were still arguing with the caterers. I was speechless, the sheer breathtaking elegance of it, the poetic justice. I had not just ruined their party. I had not just torpedoed their business deal. I had used their own grand stage, their monument, to greed, to resurrect the very history they had tried to bury. The sign they put up to keep me out would be torn down, and in its place a plaque would be erected to welcome my community's memory back in. It was not revenge. It was restoration. It was a reclamation. "Thank you, Alicia," I finally said, my voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond satisfaction. "Thank you. We did it, Joseph," she said softly. "We made them listen." I ended the call and looked at my phone again. The screen still glowed with the number 64. 64 missed calls. They no longer looked like a crisis. They looked like the dying echoes of an empire built on a rotten foundation. I started the car. The work was done. It was time to go home. It was 3 days before she came. 3 days of profound, echoing silence in my house. The city outside buzzed with the fallout. I had seen the headlines online. Sterling urban renewal bid in jeopardy after wedding fiasco. Philanthropist Joseph Hayes exposes buried history of prominent Atlanta family. The story was spreading, taking on a life of its own. But in my home, there was only quiet. I spent the time in my workshop, the scent of cedar and machine oil, a familiar comfort. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't reply to any of the hundreds of emails that had flooded my inbox. I was waiting. The doorbell rang on Wednesday afternoon. I knew it was her. I felt it in the sudden stillness of the air. I walked to the front door and opened it. Brianna stood on my porch, a ghost of the woman she had been just a few days ago. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a gray sweater. Her face was pale and drawn, scrubbed clean of makeup. Her eyes, my wife's eyes, were puffy and red-rimmed. She looked tired and broken, and for the first time in a very long time, she looked like my daughter again. She had been stripped of her sterling armor, and what was left was fragile and real. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her shoulders slumped as the first tears began to spill down her cheeks. I didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't fill the silence. I just stood there and let her feel the weight of this moment, the weight of her return. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she managed to speak, her voice a choked, broken whisper. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." I stepped back from the door, a silent invitation to enter. She walked into the living room, the room where this all began, and stood uncertainly in the middle of the floor. The tears were coming freely now, the kind of deep, ragged sobs that come from a place of true brokenness. I let her cry. I let the storm break. "It was all a lie," she said between sobs. "The whole thing. I thought their world was so perfect, so strong. It was all so shiny, Dad. The parties, the influence, the way people would listen when they spoke. I wanted to be a part of it so badly. I started to believe that our world, the one you built for me, was small. I thought your work, the foundation, your values were old-fashioned." She winced as she said the word as if it tasted like poison. "I was so desperate to impress them, to prove I belonged, that I started to see you through their eyes. When they suggested you not give the speech, I told myself it was about tradition. But I knew it was because they thought you weren't polished enough. When Adam called the foundation a hobby, I hated it, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't want them to think I was ungrateful. And the sign," she choked on the word, "the picture at the door. I swear to you, Dad, I thought it was an honor. I thought it was a clever way to include you without upsetting their perfect arrangements. I was so blind. I was so stupid. I couldn't see that they weren't honoring you. They were erasing you, and I helped them do it." She sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "He left me, Dad." The wedding was canceled before the first dance. The moment the story about the Renaissance ballroom broke and the politicians started leaving, it was over. Adam's father looked at me like I was a bad investment. Adam didn't even have the courage to tell me to my face. He had his lawyer send me a text message an hour later officially terminating the engagement. I wasn't his fiancé. I was a liability, a failed merger. I listened to all of it, every painful, humiliating detail. I felt a father's protective anger rise in me, a desire to shield her from the cruelty of the world she had chosen. But I pushed it down. What she needed now was not a protector. What she needed was a foundation. I walked over and sat down in the armchair opposite her, the same place I had sat just a week ago. "They hurt you," I said, my voice quiet. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. She had expected a lecture, and "I told you so." She had not expected empathy. I nodded. "They used you, Brianna. And when you were no longer useful, they threw you away. That is the nature of their world. It is built on transactions, not relationships." "But I was so wrong," she whispered. "I disrespected you. I disrespected Mom's memory." "Yes," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You were. You were wrong. You were not wrong for wanting a good life, a big life. Every parent wants that for their child. Your mistake was thinking you had to trade your soul to get it. You thought my world was small and their world was big. But look what happened. Their big world, built on greed and secrets and stolen ground, it's a house of cards. It collapsed at the first gust of wind, the first breath of truth. My world, our world, the one you thought was so small it's still standing. Because it's built on something real." I leaned forward. "Your mother's legacy, the work we do at the foundation, the community we have served for 40 years. That is not a burden holding you back from a bigger life, Brianna. It is the bigger life. It's the ground beneath your feet. It's the only thing that's real. The Sterling's world is an illusion, and illusions, no matter how beautiful or glittering, always, always disappear." I let the words settle in the quiet room. She looked at me, her eyes full of a dawning understanding, the painful clarity that comes only after you have lost everything. "I hear your words," I said softly, "and I believe you are sorry. But sorry is a start, not a destination. It's the first step on a long road back. A relationship, a real one, isn't a piece of glass that you can glue back together and pretend it was never broken. It's something you have to rebuild piece by piece with honesty and hard work." She nodded, wiping the tears from her face. "I know. I'll do anything. I'll earn back your trust." I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her. The arrogant, ambitious woman was gone. In her place was someone humbled, someone who had seen the abyss and pulled back just in time. The healing would be long. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of hope. The foundation was still there, and we could rebuild. 6 months passed. 6 months of quiet, steady work. The seasons changed. Autumn gave way to a mild winter, and winter was now beginning to soften into the promise of spring. The world, it seemed, had moved on. The Sterling's urban renewal bid had collapsed under the weight of public scandal. Their name, once a symbol of power, was now a quiet synonym for greed. I did not follow the news of their decline. It was not my concern. My concern was rebuilding. Today the sun was bright, the air crisp and clean. I stood on the wide sidewalk in front of what was still for now called the Sterling Grand Hall. But I was not alone. Beside me stood Brianna. The transformation in her was not dramatic. It was subtle and all the more real for it. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a calm, thoughtful presence. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that was more impressive than any designer suit she had ever worn. She had been working at the foundation, starting from the bottom, learning the stories of the students, understanding the weight of her mother's legacy. She was earning her way back, not just to my forgiveness, but to her own self-respect. We were not there just to look. A group of about a dozen bright-eyed college students, the newest class of Isabella Hayes Scholarship recipients, stood with us. They looked up at this grand marble entrance and at the new addition that had been permanently installed just last week. There, bolted to the cold white marble, was a large, magnificent plaque of burnished bronze. It was impossible to miss. It was the first thing every visitor would now have to see. Brianna stepped forward to address the students. Her voice was clear and steady. This building, she began, is a lesson in foundations. On the surface, it looked strong, impressive. But the ground it was built on was not solid. For almost 30 years, this was the site of a place called the Renaissance Ballroom. She gestured to the plaque. I let my eyes trace the engraved letters, my heart swelling with a quiet, powerful pride. The heading was bold. The Renaissance Ballroom, 1948-1972. Below it, the text told the story. It spoke of the music, the art, the community that had thrived within its walls. It spoke of it being a cultural heart, a place of sanctuary and celebration for Atlanta's Black community. And then, in dignified, factual language, it told the story of its end of the predatory legal and financial tactics that had forced its sale. It did not name Arthur Sterling in anger, it simply stated the facts of the transaction. The final line was a dedication. This plaque honors the vibrant community that flourished here and the enduring legacy of the artists, leaders, and families who filled this place with life. May their memory be a permanent foundation. Brianna was now explaining the details to the students, using the story not as a weapon of revenge, but as a lesson in history and ethics, in the importance of knowing where you come from. She was not just reading words from a plaque. She was passing on our history. She was embracing her heritage and using its painful lessons to educate the next generation. I looked at my daughter, and for the first time in over a year, I saw the woman I had always hoped she would become. A woman who understood that true strength isn't about the height of the building you are in, but about the integrity of the foundation you stand upon. I realized in that moment that I had not found my joy in the Sterling's public downfall. I hadn't found it in the panicked phone calls or the canceled contracts. The victory was not in their destruction. It was here, in this moment of restoration. It was in the quiet dignity of this bronze plaque, a permanent testament to the truth. It was in watching my daughter with a newfound humility and wisdom build a bridge between the past and the future. Our own relationship was being rebuilt, not back to what it was, but into something new, something stronger, forged in the fire of loss and rebuilt on a foundation of hard-won honesty. I looked up at the bright blue sky and felt the warmth of the sun on my face. I thought of Isabella. I thought of the promise I had made to her so long ago. I had kept it. Her legacy was safe. Our history was secure. And our daughter, our wonderful, complicated daughter, had finally come home. The order had been restored, and there was peace. Through this ordeal, I learned a profound lesson. True wealth is not measured by the figures in your bank account, but by the strength of the foundation upon which your life is built. A foundation of integrity, history, and self-respect is more valuable than any fortune. They thought they could buy my silence and erase my history with money, But they failed to understand that a legacy built on truth is more enduring than any marble hall. I learned that sometimes the quietest actions create the loudest impact, and that true power lies not in loud demands, but in the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. What do you believe is more important? Family loyalty or standing up for the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.